Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we are here live at the World Trade Center for a multi-state operator panel. Today, my guests include Wes Abney, Justin Ruiz, Jerry Derevyanny, and Kacey Morrissey. Wes is the mad genius behind the Northwest Leaf, a cannabis magazine prioritizing the patient's voice. Co-founded in Seattle in 2010, they celebrated their 100th issue last October, and they'll celebrate their 9th anniversary next month in June. Northwest Leaf, Oregon Leaf, and Alaska Leaf are monthly magazines that cover cannabis from every angle. The magazine has been a leader in providing high-quality journalism, photography, and a web hub for both the recreational and medicinal marijuana community. In July of 2014, Wes expanded with the Oregon Leaf, and in 2016 launched Alaska Leaf, then recently expanded to the East Coast with the Maryland Leaf. Wes is also the co-host of the Leaf Life podcast, as well as a cannabis producer-processor in Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and Nevada, with access to over 1,000-store distribution channel, making cannabis-infused edibles called Leafchews and a medical version called Leafchews. Next up is Justin Ruiz, owner of Hypeherbally Cannabis Shop. Justin has been heavily involved in the cannabis space since 1999 when he got involved with HempFest, first as a fellow protester, and then he began supporting the event through vending in 2007. In 2011, Justin established Hypeherbally, a medical marijuana dispensary, recently reopened as a 21 and over licensed cannabis rec shop. Justin is proud to have helped pioneer the Washington cannabis industry as we know it today, and has been busy creating a lifestyle brand around Hypeherbally, named #1 name in Washington State by the Seattle Times. Last year, Justin and Wes launched a shuttle tour service together called Higher Than a Space Shuttle. Justin, thanks for coming on board. From New York commercial litigator to general counsel of the largest recreational company in Washington State, Jerry Derevyanny is the executive vice president of corporate development and director of Cannex Capital Group. Cannex was founded in 2017 and is managed by a team of experienced industry and capital markets experts who are committed to aggressive, cost-effective growth. Cannex facilitates growth through cash flow from operations, strategic acquisitions, partnerships, and by leveraging the expertise of its experienced operational team. Cannex provides a range of comprehensive and flexible growth options for licensed cannabis cultivators, processors, and or rec shops domestically and internationally, including providing turnkey real estate with operational infrastructure as well as long-term advisory and consulting services. Cannex is a publicly traded company listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange under the symbol CNNX. And remotely, today we have Kacey Morrissey with us. She's the Director of Industry Analytics at New Frontier Data. Educated as an engineer with experience in institutional asset management, Morrissey brings a unique blend of technical analytical abilities, intuitive market awareness, and a high-level understanding of institutional risk management to the cannabis industry. Since joining New Frontier Data in 2015, she's developed economic models to produce some of the most accurate and widely quoted industry market projections in the legal cannabis industry, as well as produce the first preliminary analysis of global cannabis demand. Prior to joining New Frontier, Morrissey was a senior investment analyst at the Hershey Trust Company, where she was responsible for public and private equity investment, due diligence, and analysis for the Trust's $12 billion investment portfolio. Today's multi-state operator panel is hosted at the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center in Tacoma grows trade and investment by providing direct access to the largest business network in the world with 300 offices in 99 countries. The World Trade Center in Tacoma is the lone trade service for the Pacific Northwest. The seminars, award ceremonies, and conferences can generate contacts and contracts. Trade research can clarify opportunities, and their matchmaking can turn those opportunities into trade. The e-commerce export store has partnered with Alibaba and is translated into 18 languages with about 40,000 unique visitors every month, giving your product an opportunity to be seen globally. All right, Kacey, this first question goes out to you. The cannabis industry is quickly becoming big business. Last year, U.S. consumer spending eclipsed $10 billion for the first time and is projected to increase to $23 billion by 2022. Investment activity boomed last year, increasing to $13.8 billion. All this growth comes amidst continued federal prohibition of the industry's staple product. Currently, 33 states plus D.C. have legal medical cannabis programs, and while 10 states plus D.C. have legalized cannabis for adult use. So it begs the question, is 2019 the year that you should get involved in the cannabis industry, or is it just simply too late to jump in?
So I'd say for those looking to get involved in the cannabis industry at this point, there really is no better time than right now. We're still at the beginning of what's going to be a long race. There will be more risk, in entering today than entering tomorrow. But, with that risk comes significant opportunity because these earlier stakeholders can then command a premium for the value that they're bringing to the market. So part of the reason I believe the market is still so attractive comes from watching the evolution of consumer trends, particularly the evolution of product types and consumer preferences. Consumer preferences are still so immature, and there's significant opportunity to help shape the future of the consumer market, whether it's innovating new product classes, creating effect-based products or experiences, or products that are tailored to produce a highly replicable and consistent experience. It's all still new, and particularly in states that are only just getting their legal markets off the ground. So I really believe that the innovations today are going to lay the foundation for the industry's future growth, and there's still a lot of growth to be had.
Anybody else have anything else to add?
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed over the last decade in cannabis is that there really has never been a ground floor, so to speak, to enter. And this is really an industry that you can enter at any point. And I do believe that, 2019 might be the time to do it, simply being that as federal prohibition continues to kind of end and we get more and more regulated markets and more business opportunities, they're going to go towards larger and larger investment groups, larger and larger capital opportunities. And so the chance to enter as potentially like a smaller, medium scale business, that time is now. For the large, well-capitalized big companies, the opportunity to enter this market is always going to be there. But if you're thinking about this, whether it's investing or starting your own company, I think 2019 is the year to do it, or for sure 2020, because this is going to become such a tremendously large and valuable industry that in a few years it might be out of the reach of say, the average investor, average individual.
Justin Ruiz here, Hypeherbally. Just wanted to add that as states go green, it's definitely a great time to get in, but for states that are already kind of fully in, it's a little bit late, like Wes is saying.
My only thing is to really agree with both of you guys, pretty much everybody. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of opportunity out there. I think what Justin is saying is absolutely true. You got to be careful in mature states because you're up against pretty established competition that's been through the ringer before. In other states, I think there's still a definite chance for anybody that has an edge that they bring to the industry or some kind of, something unique that they're doing. I think there's still a huge opportunity set that they can pursue.
Are you able to talk about your current merger, or at least the generalities behind that? Why now?
Yeah, 100%. I can definitely talk about the merger. Why now? Well, the opportunity was right in front of us. We would be silly not to take it. I think both sides realize that. To give you some background, Cannex Capital has a lot of really specialized in, call it back of the house stuff, growing, processing. They understand distribution really well. The founders come out of commercial seafood. They really understand the nuts and bolts of operations incredibly well, especially large scale kind of creation and distribution operations. They've been battle tested, is what we pretty much call it. On the forefront side, they went at it the other way. They've been battle tested on the regulatory side, winning licenses in very competitive jurisdictions, being really good on the retail side, having an unbelievably in-depth understanding of the capital markets. So with those things in mind, we saw such unbelievable synergies, and synergies are, people throw that word around quite a bit, but when we looked at each other, we were like, kind of matching puzzle pieces in a way. And it came together pretty quickly after that. So we're just really looking forward to finalizing that and moving forward. But yeah, that was kind of the genesis of the merger.
So with Wes, the changing tides created an environment where businesses that were first to establish themselves in the early cannabis markets are now looking to expand into other states. So raising the potential for significant growth as the multi-state companies increase their footprint in the nascent national industry. So where do you see the opportunities, and how should someone go about it?
Well, I think when we look at currently established cannabis companies establishing in new states, there's really two different ways to go about it. The first is to compete to acquire a license, either produce, process, retail, or deliver cannabis in a new market. And the other opportunity is to license a brand into a new market. And both kind of have their advantages. And the reason for this overall scenario is that cannabis is still illegal federally. So right now, if you're a Washington state producer of cannabis, you can't sell your weed anywhere else in the country. You also are in a scenario where the laws in Washington are drastically different from Oregon, from Nevada, from Maryland, wherever else. And so it's a completely shifting and constantly shifting regulatory landscape that's led to these individual states' rights experiments to create cannabis businesses. So if you've set up a business in Washington, just as an example, and you're doing well with it, you can't just say, okay, well, we're selling lots of pot in Washington, let's export it elsewhere. So if you want to go to another state, let's say Oklahoma, you have those two options of either going out and acquiring your own license or setting up a licensing agreement. There's kind of advantages and disadvantages to both. Obviously, with the first option, acquiring a license is not very easy to do. There are certain states that have made that process simpler, but many of them now are requiring, guaranteed capital investments, multi-million-dollar investments just to even enter the marketplace. And then you have to be able to meet the regulatory demands. You have to be able to bring a product to market in that environment and succeed in that competitive environment. Now, for the companies that have the right level of capital, business experience, and development skills, that can be a really attractive opportunity. Because if you have a grow or a producer or a retail operation in a state that works, chances are it's going to work in an emerging market. It's just a matter of figuring out the capital, figuring out the details, and sometimes just getting lucky enough to land a license in states where there might be less than 20 available, which has been the case in quite a few markets. The other option is for companies that are established that have created brands that can go to these new markets. And that's really what excites me, is the future of cannabis branding and the future of cannabis in general, is that someday, we're going to see the Coca-Cola of cannabis sold everywhere. And that company is somewhere floating around here right now in the US or Canada. And we don't really know who is going to be that Coca-Cola yet, so to speak. And so we have all these companies that are creating brands, creating products, creating beautiful packaging and setting them up to sell. And instead of making the investment to go to a new state, acquire the license, grow the cannabis, process it, distribute it, all those fun things, what a lot of companies are doing is now licensing their products into a pathway into these new markets, creating an opportunity to sell their products in another market without having to make that initial investment. And that can be tricky too, because it does require a good partnership, good contracts, and a lot of trust. But what that does allow is for companies to expand outward without having to put down that hard cash, which is really advantageous. And the second reason it's really important to look at branding and licensing as opposed to hard investments in these new markets is that eventually the states' rights experiment scenario is going to end. Someday cannabis is going to be federally legal. Someday growers in Washington will be able to export their cannabis, whether it's to Oregon or whether it's to Germany. We don't know fully yet. But import-export will be real. State lines will be opened. And at some point, it won't make sense to have a lab or a grow necessarily in 10 states, as some of the big companies are setting up right now. It'll make sense to have regionally located producer processors, regionally located distributors, and nationally ran brands and companies. And so the branding and licensing opportunities that exist right now in these emerging markets gives people the opportunity to spread and build their brand and their value and grab market share without having to make those capital investments that might not ever pay off. And that's one thing that I really see kind of looming over the cannabis industry is all of these massive investments going into hard facilities, $10 million into a grow, $5 million into a lab. These are drops in the bucket compared to some of the large scale investments being made. I don't know that betting everything on a single state producing enough revenue for a company to earn back, say, 10, 20, $30 million in capital investments is going to be there in a timeline that works where we're heading with national and international legalization. And so I think that's the important question that companies need to ask themselves as they're expanding is, do we really want to invest in creating new businesses, or do we want to find strategic ways to expand our business and our brand that we've already created? And, the answer varies depending on the market, depending on the scenario. But I think overall, we're in still an experimental phase of legalization of medical cannabis, and that we're going to end up seeing a shifted landscape several times over before we get to where we'll eventually end up at some point where cannabis is truly legal, it's truly interstate. And then it's like Coca-Cola. If you get a Coke in, Japan or a Coke in Oklahoma, that's the same Coca-Cola. And I think that's where cannabis is going to end up, subtracting for agricultural variabilities. But we're going to end up in that point where it's a truly national and international commodity. And it's really exciting to see where companies are going and how they're choosing to tackle the issue of expansion.
It's funny, we talk a lot about this at Cannex and Forefront. One of our kind of shared philosophies is we call it monopoly versus risk in terms of what's going on right now. We think even some investors, I think, have the maybe mistaken perception that it's a game of monopoly, license accumulation. Just get licenses in different states, put little dots on the map everywhere. We look at it a little bit differently. In monopoly, you're trying to acquire as much property as possible and build the hotels and everything. You don't really, you shouldn't. Just a little tip on monopoly. You should pretty much buy any property that you land on if you can. In risk, it's a little bit different. You pick your strategic kind of locations and you go and you apply some significant strength there to get some operational leverage. And I think that's exactly how we look at it. So there's some certain obvious key states that we are planning to prioritize, which is California, Massachusetts, Illinois. Massachusetts, Illinois, especially in the near term, with Illinois being kind of a question mark depending on what their recreational timeline looks like. But Massachusetts, especially, you have a state that's, 1/8 the size of Washington with roughly the same population, a lot more tourism, and way less licenses, and honestly, unbelievable, way less experience in doing the things that they're going to have to be doing. So that's, we think, a kind of a great market in terms of developing what the strategies are going to be going forward. It's going to be incredibly interesting to see. I completely agree with Wes. Which way it pivots? Is it going to be Coca-Cola? Tough, right? Because it's an organic product that is different every time, and people actually use the end product versus hops that always gets extracted into something. So it'll be interesting to see if it goes that way or maybe more towards the microbrew model or something like that. In any case, I hear you loud and clear, and that's something we definitely think about is how much money do you put in, and what's the timeline of getting it out? Are you doing right by your investors by picking projects that are very solid returns on capital on a risk-adjusted basis? And we obviously try to do it. I will say that even if it, my personal feeling is, given how I've seen regulations develop, even if we legalized it tomorrow, you're talking about a minimum of 2 to 3 years before you get interstate commerce. Because even right now, I don't think most people realize how difficult it is. If you manufacture vodka here in downtown Tacoma, how difficult it is to export that vodka into, say, Tennessee, what the licensing is, what you have to do, what the thicket of regulation is. It's actually quite challenging. And to build all that regulation, it took a long time. So I expect that to be the case with cannabis even more so, unfortunately. But yeah, that's kind of the way that we look at the multi-state operations and that kind of thing.
And interestingly enough, you touched on kind of that timeline for legalization in interstate, and you said 2 to 3 years there, Jerry. I personally think it could be 5 to 10, or perhaps even a little longer. And the example I always give is this: let's say our current president decides to legalize pot tomorrow on a whim. Just because the gavel is banged or the bill is signed and pot is air quotes legal, there are going to be massive amounts of regulation to figure out, states' rights arguments, states' rights lawsuits. And I see this a lot down in Oregon, where I've been publishing a magazine for about 5 years now. Oregon has 6 times the amount of cannabis that's been sold in a year based on state data recreationally in current inventory heading into this current harvest season. And so the state has literally 1 million pounds in excess of cannabis that they can't sell. And almost every grower I talk to down there says, oh, we just want to be able to export our pot. And I think that is the future of cannabis. But my question to these folks in Oregon is always, why would someone in Kentucky want to buy your pot instead of grow their own? Why would someone in Oklahoma want to buy Oregon weed when they could have their own economic opportunity? Why would a state like Maine say we should import all our pot and let the jobs go somewhere else as opposed to creating our own industry? And then you get into the complex regulatory nature of just how to distribute and sell these products, which varies so drastically from state to state that I really see a mess of legalization. And so personally, I think that we're a few years out from federal legalization, possibly 2020 based on the presidential race, possibly 2024 or further even. And once that happens, we're going to have states that are extremely entrenched in this business, selling $1 billion a year plus in cannabis, taking in, a third to half of that in tax revenues. And they're not going to want to give that up. They're not going to want to give up the control, the regulatory aspect, or the tax revenue, let alone the job opportunities that are being created by the industry. And so I really see kind of an issue coming for anyone who thinks that legalization is going to be a switch that gets flipped. It will be a piece of paper that gets signed, and we'll have, one day legalization, but it's going to take a number of years, in my opinion, before all that translates into, okay, I just grew or processed pot here in Washington. Now I want to sell it in Oregon. We're ways out.
According to some New Frontier data, it looks like the opportunities is still in Canada. Big alcohol and tobacco accounted for nearly half of 2018's total cannabis investment at $13.8 billion. So they might know something that other investors don't. So Jerry, over 40% of cannabis business owners surveyed in October of 2017 were planning to take their companies into a new market within the next year, according to the Marijuana Business Daily. Yet limits on the number of available licenses, a lack of access to capital, and the logistic hurdles of operating a business in accordance with various state and local regulations are all likely to contribute to the relatively low percentage of business owners who actually take their companies into those new markets. So there's clearly a delta between the perception and reality. And I want to know, I'm curious about ultimately what's stopping these businesses from making that expansion.
I think it's a lot of those reasons that you named are the exact same reasons as a typical business would have trouble expanding, right? Access to capital, just a lot of these businesses. So I think there's a really big difference between expanding and scaling that people often don't appreciate. So you can expand restaurants, right? You can make 1 restaurant, 2 restaurants, 3 restaurants. There's some economies of scale, but a lot of stuff you have to redo. The problem in cannabis is basically every state might as well be a different country. You have to repeat everything that you're doing in every new state with different permutations, adaptions. There's a huge regulatory layer that you have to deal with. I think a lot of those people are just going to run into those kinds of problems, and they realize that it's not as easy as all that to go into that next market, because that next market contains a whole different set of land use laws, a whole different set of stakeholders to deal with. You have to hire new people. It's really difficult. I would say one of the ways that a lot of people could potentially do it in a different way is, as these multi-state operators develop, you will, I think, start to see those that have solid operational underpinnings, those that can actually execute versus those that have assembled a lot of licenses and they're trying to backfill their abilities a little bit. And to some extent, it's going to be a big opportunity, I think, for some of the smaller undercapitalized players to basically say, okay, I'm going to hitch my star to this bigger company that on a good, fair deal, and be able to expand my brand that way, or else I don't really have the capability of expanding it and bringing it to more people. I think you will end up seeing, and I certainly think that the Cannex Forefront combination is going to be one of those platforms eventually where you will be able to get an authentic, we are going to have a collection of very authentic brands that we brought to a lot of different states, starting with the ones that were developed in Washington.
And I would say, that is the choice to make, is can a company actively scale on their own? And I think that there's a lot of high hopes in cannabis and a lot of potentially inflated evaluations, inflated revenue goals, and a lack of understanding that this is an agricultural product on, not necessarily a race to the bottom, but on a race to scale in terms of production. And a lot of people still view cannabis as an illegal drug or a semi-illegal drug with values that were based on the black market or gray market. But once this is fully legal, it is a weed. It grows like a weed. It grows relatively easy, especially when it's being produced for biomass purposes. And so someday cannabis is going to be very cheap. As Justin always likes to say, it's going to be just like hops. Hops is only worth so much money. It's still a multi-billion-dollar industry, but where hops becomes valuable is when it's turned into something. And at a certain level, cannabis is just an agricultural commodity. And I think that's the most important thing for people to remember. And when you're going into new markets and thinking about replicating success and putting, large amounts of money on the line, when you're selling pot at $1 or $2 a gram, it takes a lot of biomass to be able to make back those initial investments. And I really like that analogy of scale versus expansion, because a lot of companies aren't really thinking about where they're going to actually end up and the bottom line of what they actually need to make to return their investments.
I feel like that goes along with a lot of dreams that were being sold to a lot of these people who are initially trying to get into the industry. And so now that that's known, we're trying to get down to this common price point for the country, but yet still there's people kind of traveling back in time who are able to start from that point that we were able to. And if you look back at how even our rec industry price points started, it was really ridiculous at the beginning, and then it quickly got snapped into reality. And I think some others wheels got turning because there was a lot of the blind leading the blind selling dreams, and it's those same guys who were selling dreams. They're essentially the guys selling the shovels and the sifters to the gold rush, and they made out good.
Yeah, I do remember the Botech report that said that we were going to be selling wholesale $6 a gram in Washington State. Apparently, that turned out to be inaccurate, as we all know. I actually wanted to throw back to something Kacey said. I think one of the things that we talk about, but I don't think fully appreciate, is the size of the potential market. And I'm certainly not advocating that every single person go out and start using cannabis, but you have to realize that like 42% of adults in the United States will use alcohol at some point in the last month. Number's about 14%. So you have this big percentage of people that are totally okay with one kind of intoxicant, right? That have yet to try marijuana or don't regularly use it. And the kinds of products, we don't really even know the kinds of products that are going to be appealing to those people. Wellness products, a lot of, I think, one of the companies that Cannex is buying right now is a company in California called Pure Ratios. They do CBD and THC patches as their main product, but they have a lot of other salves and something like that with Ayurvedic medicine, and it's run by a practitioner, like a guy that's been doing Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine for 20 years, recognized leader in the space. Maybe that kind of product is going to resonate with a lot of people, and it's going to be a very broad-based product with CBD and THC. That is this exciting stuff. And to the extent that there's investment, opportunities for smaller people to get into the industry, taking a look ahead into that market, I think it's very early now, but that probably has some of the best returns that you could possibly have. And is Kacey still on the line? I do have to ask, is it the Hershey Trust, like the Hershey family, the candy family?
Hershey chocolates. So Milton Hershey and his wife couldn't have children, and they left their fortune to a school for underprivileged kids. And the $12 billion trust runs that school.
Wow. So it's like Bruce Wayne's school for the gifted?
Something like that.
Yeah. I just asked because I was a litigator in New York City, and some of the cases I worked on were for Hershey's, who are, as you might imagine, very protective of their Kisses trademark. So.
Yeah, I'm aware.
That's a great point that Jerry made. So basically, we're just thinking of this niche psychoactive market, and it's a really a bubble. And if you look at even the alcohol market, which he said is another intoxicant that's widely socially acceptable. If you look at what they do, they even make candies that are flavored with alcohol with a small amount. That's trace amounts that won't get anybody intoxicated. And we can do that with terpenes and flavonoids as well. And we can take things like, so we do like think of an oxygen bar with terpene infused, and then you got all these people who don't necessarily know anything about cannabis, maybe still have that like faux pas, like real like intimidated by the whole nature of it, and then they go in and they get these different notes that they're all of a sudden obsessed with flavor wise, and then they're like, wow, their curiosity at least is piqued at that point, and then they're more understanding at the very least to what's going on. They realize it's not just about getting stoned, and then maybe they're even curious about hitting a vape pen next or something like that. But it's those people with those training wheels on could even become a psychoactive customer way down the line. But my point is, there's a market that's here that we're barely tapped on, and what Jerry was talking about, we just barely even scratched the surface, and we're looking at concentrates as the I mean, Oregon alone could, with all their really bad weed right now, they could just turn all that into terpenes for this new CBD market, and essentially infuse all the CBD with natural native cannabis derived terpenes that make it an experience where you're essentially smoking everything, but you're not getting any kind of THC headache or even, compromising your job if it's still some state that's not green yet, that's not able to enjoy this.
We're definitely seeing the opportunities. May not be local businesses, but according to New Frontier data, it looks like the number of states that are leading the multi-state operator is Acreage Holdings. I'm not sure if this is still true with some recent M&As, but it looks like at the time that this was released, they had 19 states, Acreage Holdings. MedMen had 12, Cureleaf had 11, Green Thumb had 10. And so the average number of dispensary licenses held by a multi-state operator is 61, and the average market cap of multi-state operators is 1.64 billion. And so there's definitely some opportunities, but I'm not seeing a lot of companies take advantage of them. So Justin, Washington State recently tried to implement rule changes that would have affected over 70% of the edibles market and would have resulted in higher compliance costs and potentially lost market share. One company is suing the Idaho State Police over seizure of 7,000 pounds of hemp mistaken for cannabis. So ultimately, whether it's avoiding potential farm bill confusions when shipping CBD or just general advice, what can you tell companies in emerging cannabis markets how to prepare for a volatile regulatory environment?
I would say that this is probably a question better fit for my colleague Wes, but I'm going to give it a good shot on how to answer it. There's been so many curveballs thrown. The best thing that I've heard lately that kind of gave me a little push to keep going, because I always hit walls and need, fourth, fifth wind, is it's a marathon, not a race. A lot of people are in a race, and like what Wes touched on before is people are so quick to try and get a return on investment on these unrealistic multi-million-dollar loans in one single state. And I think that if you're going to be prepared for this, you just need to understand that this is a proving grounds right now, and you need to just be able to survive. And so the best thing I can say is just roll with the punches and expect that there's going to be things to change. And the best thing that I could have done is be more diligent in my local government and politics. I was kind of wrapped up in a real almost physical fight with making this real. And if I could do it all over again, I would have continued my fight that I started in my senior year, creating a bill. I would have kept pushing my own bills, and I would have tried to lobby myself. So I would encourage anybody to get down into your capital and get down into your local jurisdiction and actually try and push your own agenda, because that's, especially if you have good intentions for this.
We have a Class C felony on consumption lounges, for example. So I'm on a committee to try and overturn that felony. I'm not going to wait for somebody else. I did for 4 years, and I'm tired of it. And so the Seattle Superchronic Cafe should be a thing. There should be opportunities for that. And the first things first is to go down, meet your senators, House reps, and lobby. And I did. I found that some of them were willing to submit a bill on our behalf. So I printed out 7 or 8 bills from West Hollywood to Vegas to Alaska to New Jersey. And we're just going to pick apart those bills and submit it. I'm no bill writer. I don't know anything about politics. I don't want to know about politics, but I understand that it's a dirty necessity. And so taking something that's already in existence and not having to reinvent the wheel is an easy way, candidly, to do it. And that's quick and dirty. So that's my plan, is just kind of push forward through politics. Unfortunately, we made us politicians, right? Yeah, we did make us politicians. Unfortunately, it's not fun, but it's a necessity.
I just wanted to add one thing. We might disagree on some specific issues, but I think one thing that's actually critically important for a really well-developed professional industry is having a strong trade organization, or a set of strong trade organizations. And I think I'll make the plug for the Washington Cannabis Association, which was the one that I didn't help found, but we were involved in pretty early, and we think has done a really, really good job. For example, you talk about consumption lounges, definitely on board with that. The one thing that they were able to get passed this year that I think is really good for people that are in the shops is the fact that they were able to reduce the felony, selling to a minor felony issue down to a misdemeanor, which I think is, there wasn't a lot of enforcement, but imagine you're a bud tender, you got that in the back of your mind, like who wants to live with that? And it's just ridiculous, right? So I think one thing I'd encourage is that the actual process of politics, I don't actually think it's dirty. I think it's just difficult. People don't realize that, somebody from like Shelton, their constituency has different concerns, and what they're hearing in their ear and their experience tells them maybe something different from, somebody from downtown Seattle. And that's a process. There's a negotiation there that has to get managed, and that's the business of politics. And frankly, you really need, I think, professionals to do it, because it's very, very difficult to kind of come in and without knowing the inside baseball and understanding the process on a really nuts and bolts level, it's hard to get this kind of concrete progress, because we're not talking about these kinds of large issues anymore that are binary, like weed is legal, weed is not. We are now talking about the rulemaking, teaching your regulator that, hey, guys, we need to be able to case pack stuff, or else it's really, really hard for cannabis companies. Why? Well, what's the big deal? Well, when I take it out of the case and have to relabel it with each individual SKU to sublot it to a store, that's an incredible amount of cost for me. And a lot of that could not be deductible because of 280E. Oh, okay, well, I get it. And it's not really doing anything for public safety. That's a whole process that has to be managed, and every step of the way has to go, kind of, you just got to keep working at it. It's really, really hard. So I'd give props to Vicky Christopherson and Waka and her team. A lot of people do great work in the industry. I'm a huge fan of hers, and I think she's done an incredible job. So I would just throw that out there to people that start a legitimate or join the legitimate trade organization that's in your state, in your area.
I fully appreciate that advice, and I just wanted to add just a small perspective, is that a lot of us have been stuck in this fight that we weren't able to really get down and continue our work, like I said before, and that's a regret. I could have, loosened a little bit more of a screw, but I feel like a lot of the people who are capable that when they noticed that there was this moment could have, and I think this can happen where we learn from our mistakes, we get around the culture and recognize who are real brands and who, because I put it this way, there's going to be, if you're not all in, you're not in at all. And there's going to be the guys that are here with big money, and there's going to be the guys that have been here for the marathon the whole time, and there won't be much in between. And so recognize from very early on, especially because it's going to be really good for the big guys because it'll give them some turnkey platform, but just recognize who is a real asset and who's actually, done really great things for the community that gives you this privilege. And then wrap around them with even sometimes just free consulting. You know how much free consulting someone like I have given? I call it seeds, and I've planted many, many seeds in this industry. Tons of them actually have danced and celebrated when we've gone through our issues, because now Daniel's son can not even have to worry about Mr. Miyagi. So it's it's a weird, this community's turned into an industry, but recognize that if the big companies come in, they just recognize who's in it for that marathon, and understand that is a huge asset to this industry too, because that's the culture. We can't get rid of the culture. We can't just slap leaves and green and everybody's favorite strain on everything to manipulate them out the gate, and then just be like, this is the culture, because then at some point this is going to be even lame to the guys who jumped in it, and they're going to be like, all right, what do we do?
The culture is definitely being affected by the Canadian marketplace, but we're seeing some anomalies up in Canada for the first time. Initial sales for concentrates, for example, have decreased. That's the only market we've ever seen where sales have dipped in concentrate. The only thing I can attribute that to is a high price with low quality. But regardless, the Canadian cannabis market is slowing. We can see that in the data. I'm inferring what that means by high price, low quality. But the U.S. is accelerating. So, Jerry, looks like investors sense the Canadian cannabis market growth is flattening somewhat as it's plagued by supply shortages and disappointing earnings, maybe some overpriced, low-quality items. So in contrast, more U.S. states are legalizing recreational cannabis at a much larger market than Canada's. Cannabis companies are keenly aware that they could be bought. For those looking to be acquired, the one common question they all have beforehand is, how will this move position them as a potential acquisition target? You've recently gone through a merger yourself. How can these companies position themselves as a potential acquisition target?
Well, I think one of the number one things that they have to do as we move forward is really focus on the fundamentals of the business, because a lot of what was being done before was a little bit, there was a time in Canada a couple of years ago that you could raise money on a PowerPoint and just a really pretty presentation, and investors were throwing money at it. Those times are gone. And I think the way that people position themselves now is have something authentic and good that you own, and people will come now that there's access to capital and these bigger players with capital. They want to deploy it in places, and they definitely want to look for real opportunities. One thing that we see, unfortunately, is that it's a lot of like a rumor market, and you'll hear these kind of crazy prices that you think somebody else got, and then it spirals out of control, and it leads to some really unrealistic asks on the part of targets now, where they have some really inflated expectations, and they don't appreciate. There would be companies that we would be talking to that had, they would basically say, well, okay, well, you sell 10, we sell 5, so give us 50%, and just as an example. And we would come back and say, well, you're not public. You have, you don't get that kind of multiple. Like, there's a reason why these differences exist. I think having a good operational understanding of your business, and then having, honestly, just dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure you're compliant, make sure your licenses are good, make sure the taxes is always an issue, the 280E kind of issue. Just make sure you try to be as clean as possible on that, and that you get all the hair out up front. But I think for the people that are able to do that, there's a huge opportunity, and that they can join a growing platform. And honestly, in some of these places, they can help steer that. They can have an outsized influence on the direction of that platform, because that platform will honestly just look for operational type leaders. And I think the natural effects of that are going to be really good.
Wes, you also just expanded to Maryland, and Maryland regulations allow companies to own no more than one license in each of the state's 3 categories: growing, processing, and selling. And a new law imposed a moratorium on sales for at least another year, in part to avoid the type of consolidation that companies are trying to execute. So do you think that state residency requirements will affect investment or small business growth in Maryland like we saw in Washington?
That's a really great question, Josh. And honestly, I think that the residency requirements are a double-edged sword. And whether it's Maryland or any other state. Another great example of that is Alaska, where Alaska really set out to make the licenses worthless, in the sense of anyone who wants a license can get one, so the piece of paper doesn't have an intrinsic value like it does in other states with caps. And then they have very severe out-of-state limitations that basically say if you're not a state resident, you're not getting in. And so you look at states like Maryland and Alaska, or even Washington, that's really limited that out-of-state investment. And in some ways it's worked, and in some ways it hasn't. People in pot are creative, especially the ones that are from the old school. We had to be creative when we sold pot when it was illegal. We had to be creative when we sold pot when it was in the gray market. And you better believe that people with money will get creative in how to funnel it into these businesses and acquire ownership, whether it's through creative licensing deals, creative consulting deals, or however else people are getting around it. I personally like the intention of laws that keep closed markets in this states' rights experiment scheme of things. But I also would say that, over the 9 years that I've been publishing pot magazines and seeing the industry develop, that it hasn't really worked in the way that it was intended to, which was to create small mom and pop type markets. No matter what, this is a very valuable commodity in a market that's going to potentially be worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. So is it really working to limit licenses? I would say no. And I don't know if that's the correct direction for new legislatures and new markets to go to. Ultimately, I think that this is heading towards scale and heading towards companies that can produce it competitively. And whether those companies are local or non-local or potentially international, I think we're going to see this end up just like a regular commodity where, there's no question of, hey, are you a resident? If you want to open a restaurant or a bar or a hotel, it's a matter of, hey, do you have the permits? Do you have the licensing? Do you have the capital to make this project work? And so again, perhaps states like Alaska will remain only, Alaska-owned businesses until the day it goes federally legal. I have seen personally in Maryland that has not worked. And then interestingly enough, you have some of Maryland's largest players have sued the state to stop the issuing of more licenses, which has created controversy, especially because those licenses were earmarked to go to minorities or people who were adversely affected by the drug war. And so in that scenario, you have, some highly capitalized companies that have invested $10 to $20 million into their projects, turning around and suing to stop people who don't have that kind of resources from getting these licenses. And so when we talk local versus non-local, big money versus small money, I hate to say this on a certain level, but it just is the way that this is going. It's the direction it's going. And so we need to think pragmatically about the industry and what we really want for it, and how we best achieve that. And like Justin said earlier, it's kind of that blend of people who've been in this for a very long time, who made the sacrifices to put this here. And then you have the really big businesses who are simply, positioned well to do this, just as they would be if it was any other product or project.
So without addressing like Maryland or any state specifically, I think it's worthwhile to step back and look at, okay, why did these residency requirements exist in a lot of places initially? So in Washington, what was people forget why. It wasn't about anything other than the Cole memo. They were so scared of federal, interference, federal enforcement, that they wanted to just kind of keep it as contained as possible. And back in the old days, if you listen to some of the OG kind of regulators, they'll tell you that the FBI initially told them, we don't know if we can run background checks on out-of-staters. So you need to be in state only, which means you got to go to the Washington State Patrol. So that was one of the big reasons, right? And then I get what people are trying to do with the residency limitations, but I think it's counterproductive. You got to think about like who will be the beneficiary of that. It's going to be the guy that was already rich in that local area, right? That's where it's going to go. And then the less capital that there is to be able to buy a business, the less worth that business has, and the less opportunity to expand that business has. So the most unfortunate reality is that some really good operators that are a little undercapitalized they're just going to starve. And that's, I think, maybe something that's going on in Washington, which is really unfortunate. But I think that those have there are other ways of doing what they're trying to do potentially. And maybe even some of the consolidation risks are misplaced, because in a lot of ways, the most compliant players are going to be the ones with the most at stake, right? So potentially. So I wouldn't be as worried about the consolidation. And I think it bears mentioning that you don't have this in pretty much any other industry I'm familiar with, because it's probably unconstitutional to discriminate against out-of-state residents, and even other super highly regulated industries like gambling. You can have out-of-state ownership. You can have foreign ownership. And gambling is really interesting. As I understand, I'm certainly no expert. So if you want to own a casino, like in Washington, they're going to investigate you. And you're going to pay for them to investigate you. If you live in Macau, you're going to pay for the investigator to come out, interview you, go through other stuff, but it's legal. And if you go through that process, then it's fine. And I think, doesn't that address everything they're looking for? Making sure that the mafia and or the cartels aren't getting into it, making sure you have legitimate players that are incentivized to follow the rules within that state. Right.
So Kacey, as a follow-up question, do you think that limiting investors in Maryland will be good for small businesses and growth?
Well, I definitely agree with the double-edged sword comment. On one hand, if you're limiting external investment, you're giving the opportunity to those smaller businesses, but this is also limiting those with potentially greater expertise. So in new state markets, like Maryland, where there could be lower technical sophistication or experience, you do end up with the risk that, applicants who are awarded licenses may not be the best suited and could materialize in the form of product quality issues, supply shortages, et cetera. And then, plus these experienced stakeholders tend to bring in outside, or less experienced stakeholders will tend to bring in this outside expertise anyway, leading to capital flight out of that state market in other forms. And, additionally, limiting that outside investment can be a hindrance for local stakeholders who may not have access to those well-capitalized partners. So this becomes acutely important because, these businesses don't have recourse. They can't go to a bank or traditional institutions. So, if their access to private capital is limited, there can be sort of an unintended restrictive effect on their own expansion. And this is especially important in the initial years of the program when the regulatory disruptions and supply issues can occur.
Perfect. And so building on that, Justin, as a cannabis business expands into multiple states, access to capital becomes a key business consideration. In some instances, as state licensing regulations may require the business applying for the license to demonstrate substantial financial resources. Capital to build out facilities and business operations become critical. A business can raise capital by taking out debt, borrowing money, selling equity. So once a business begins accepting money from outside investors, a whole host of security and financial regulations become important. So as a business owner, what factors do you have or consider to determine when either you can take out a loan or give out equity? Which is kind of a loaded question because you can't take out loans.
Right. So I have vetted money from the medical days. I'm fully self-funded at this point. It's just me and my wife. We're not quite at the point where we're going to take on capital, but I definitely think that if you're new in an established market and you're going to take that risk, you should definitely go for some big money capital. I think that for me, the time is going to be when it's actually federally unscheduled. I think that right now there's a lot of structuring going on where there's some big players in the mix, but they're not quite willing to risk everything that they have going, whether a lot of them will have restaurants and all the, liquor licenses at risk. And so I think that for people like me, it'd be really smart to hold on as much as you can, self-funded, and then once it's federally unscheduled, I think there's going to be some real investors that are. I look at it right now as I know there's some real big players, but a lot of them that I see on my level are like the offshore account holding kind of guys, there's a lot of sleazy business guys in right now, and it's kind of I've never seen more gangsters in our community than right now. And it's funny because they're all trying to peg us as the black market, and you guys were the ones in the game, it's just been funny because it's kind of this fake mob vibe right now. And I'm excited for it to go legal because those guys will get crushed by who they're trying to emulate, and there'll be some real capital where we can actually access, where a business like me, with my numbers, I could access pretty much any loan I would really want if I was a normal business. And I've been in business now for almost 10 years, and it's just I'm tired of structuring bank accounts. I'm ready. I'm ready for this. So everybody else who's not really established isn't ready. They're so scared of federal legalization, but I'm so excited for it. It's going to be a beautiful thing. I think that's the best time to take on money. If you have skin in the game, there's only so many people especially after I think states go green. You're also looking at a cultural attack that happens that you'll have to survive. So if you can survive that, if you go back to that marathon concept, if you can get to that point where you're still here and you've proven your model, then right at legalization is when you get money. Hold out. It's the marathon. Hold out for that money.
It's ideal to leverage other people's money, but not at the risk of, a kneecapper, somebody coming in with hard money lending with ridiculous, you're going to lose a limb, essentially. It's not really worth it. So that's definitely a strategy. Jerry, have you seen any excessive amounts of equity giving or hard money lending? What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anybody that's going to break kneecaps, but definitely some pretty aggressive, sharky terms where we're kind of over the years, I've seen steps backwards in terms of how aggressive the terms are, but it's still pretty common. I mean, even friends and family money that I've seen in opportunities that we've diligenced has been, 18% sometimes, which is expensive, but it's not, it's less than a lot of credit cards, right? So it's not as terrible as it used to be. Yeah, definitely has gotten better though, and now with the public market, it's kind of orders of magnitude easier.
Quick question: is pre-money valuation worth a penny? In other words, if you aren't making sales and you think you have an awesome name and a brand, is it really worth anything if you aren't generating revenue?
If a tree falls in the forest, can anyone hear it? No. It depends. It really depends. I mean, some teams you come in and you see they haven't done a dime in sales, but it's something new. It's much more of a venture style investment. I've seen that in tech before, like even companies like in cannabis related tech that didn't generate a ton of dollars, but they were on a really good trajectory. I think, yeah, you would pay for that. It just makes a lot of sense in terms of what you're paying for the future value that you think you're going to get. But there unfortunately have been also on the other end, guys that put together a nice slide deck and think that it's worth 20 mil.
And I think for me, the important characterization there is if you plan to produce, process, or even retail marijuana without having sold any dollar value of that, your plans are not really worth anything. If you're holding a key piece of real estate, or you're holding a key function, or perhaps a key piece of technology, you might have something that hasn't done any revenue or created any sales that it could be potentially worth something. I think the only real exception in finding value in companies that haven't yet sold anything in cannabis is either in the tech segment of it, and there's a lot of tech that's coming to cannabis. There's so much data from the production, processing, retail side to just the consumer side, or in the branding. One of the things that Justin and I are working on with our space shuttle project is to create a brand and create a model for a company that will have value before it actually makes a single sale per se. But that is all grounded in branding and in the capability of rolling out licensing agreements and generating revenue passively without massive capital investments. And
I stopped giving out my ideas, by the way. I don't mention any of them anymore. I got tons of ideas though.
Justin's the idea man. And the reason I say this is any brand, if you have a way to put it into a market, it will be valuable. If you have the brand and you have the packaging, you have the pipelines to funnel products through and create verticals, you will be worth money. But to just simply say, I have a plan to grow weed, and if you fund me, it's going to be worth X amount of dollars. I look at companies like that entirely as liabilities. How much are you asking for? That's your liability. How do you plan to overcome that and even make a single dollar in profit? And a lot of times these companies can't answer it. And I deal with companies like that all the time, $5, $10, $20 million in, that aren't making money now and don't have the potential to really make money in the future. And that's a scary place to be.
That's a good transition, Jerry, because it is a normal market, or it's becoming normalized. Investors seem to be.
When things get ugly, it's time to go to me.
Yes. The pretty man. The investors are looking at everything through the traditional investment lens. They're looking at management, business plans, and valuations. You can look at traditional valuation analysis for a discounted cash flow, accretion dilution analysis for earnings per share. They're comparative analysis through EBITDA, public comps if available through acquisition comparables, transaction analysis, and eventually leverage buyouts. But we just saw PAX come up with an arbitrary valuation of $420 million, and it even said the institutional investors were novice, or not novice. They didn't have experience in the industry, so it's new institutional investors coming in. So I'm curious, have you seen improper valuations deteriorate credibility yet with investors, potentially causing shareholder lawsuits? The reason why I ask is because if you create an arbitrary number of $420 million, in the eventuality that share or that stock price goes down, you will have people sue you. It's just a matter of time. So I'm curious if it's too early for that because so many speculators. Have you seen improper valuations create shareholder potential lawsuits?
I'm not sure that improper valuation is the right term, right? Because they do their best. if you think about it, the investment bankers, right? They're charged with kind of two things: trying to make sure that the other side makes money, a little bit of money, but mainly they're charged with getting maximum value out of what they're selling, which is the equity of the company. So they're trying to get the best price. So to the extent that they're able to sell and without going past what securities laws allows and not lie to people, but present an honest picture, give people the risk, but say, hey, listen, we think there's a ton of upside here. You guys come in and buy it at, $420 million offering at whatever the valuation was. I think they've probably done their jobs in a lot of ways, as long as they've done a good job diligencing and they have not gone out over their skis. Now, if that goes down, yeah, you're gonna have lawsuits. People lose enough money, you're gonna have a lawsuit regardless of you could have been the most honest human being on earth. Just might get a lawsuit. I think on a broader note, yeah, we've definitely seen the valuations in the public market start to come down. One of the biggest things that you'll read in a lot of the equity analysts that look at the space, they kind of expect a Canada-US rebalancing, in that the Canadian multiples they think are going to come down a little bit, and the US multiples are probably going to tick up a little bit as things move forward. But yeah, I think there is a danger of kind of credibility to the space. But on the other hand, I don't really know. I have to think that the PAX people, who I think run a pretty good business from everything I've heard, I haven't looked at their files, but they're obviously well known, Washington, California, et cetera. I have to think that they think that there's upside in their business, right? And that they're going to continue to execute.
I don't know, Jerry. Time will tell. Yeah. So Kacey, this one's going back to you with multi-state operators that are rapidly expanding into new markets looking to scale up. It's fueling the U.S. cannabis consolidation. Top investing trends of 2019 can be seen in multi-state operators, data, and consumption lounges or cannabis cafes, with honorable mentions to vape, accurate dosing, and beverages. So do you see the data coming from U.S.-based multi-state operators ready to deploy big cash in 2019? Or do you expect that Canadian cannabis companies are going to increase their cross-border acquisitions and deals?
Well, I think both things are going to happen. On the U.S. side, I think that multi-state operators are increasingly betting on two things. One, that more major states are about to legalize recreational cannabis, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, potentially, and then maybe a state like Texas might pass med. And in New York and New Jersey, there's been some hiccups that have slowed momentum, but they're still, fully expected to eventually pass adult use laws, and the multi-state operators are betting on that. And then two, I think these multi-state operators are also betting on, federal legalization happening in the near term. The recent deal between Canopy Growth and Acreage, the acquisition hinging on U.S. federal legalization is a very strong illustration of this, and how much these operators are hinging on the future of a federal legalization. I think another signal also is the types of companies that these operators are interested in. So, they're acquiring the companies with the technical and operational expertise to benefit them in the long haul in this type of federally legal environment. I
don't want to open up a can of worms, but I heard that at $1.74, Canopy Growth will be bankrupt the day that the U.S. legalizes. I know that's maybe hyperbole to say, but at $1.74, I don't think they're going to be able to compete once California is able to do sun-grown cannabis. So I don't know. Any opinions about that?
I mean, I think a lot of things can happen, and I think especially in this industry, the unintended effects of something like that happening. I mean, I think it's hard to tell. We've tried to predict a lot of things at New Frontier Data. We've got a lot right, but there's just so many unknowns. So
I think this is going to turn into fully it's going to be like a restaurant, essentially. There's going to be food, there's going to be some beer, there's going to be fresh squeezed rosin, there's going to be, all these little, but it's not going to be, not one of them is going to, we're just banking too much off, even just our sales of our pre-run. We're banking way too hard on that. That should be our pre-run again. And if we start getting into the terpenes and other things that aren't just psychoactive, we can really understand what this is going to be fully. But I think if we're going to get smart, it's going to be like other business branding, so then you're going to have to actually have a brand, not just a green something, and you're going to need to, yeah, that's basically it. You're just going to have to, it's just going to be like normal. money grew on trees for a while, and that's ending and that is over in some states. It's just, we got to get realistic about it.
100%. And, one thing for me, I always tell people, if your pro forma is built on selling cannabis at $2 a gram and you're selling it at $1.90, you're going to go out of business. And I think that there are a lot of companies that don't realize that or don't see the writing on the wall. And even companies that are failing because they didn't realize that are driving the wholesale value of cannabis even lower. As companies are failing or struggling, they're selling cannabis at a loss just to try and keep capital flowing. And it's creating a race to the bottom, especially here in the Northwest, where we have some of the most established cannabis businesses, even down in California, where the price of cannabis is low on a wholesale level, high because of the retail taxes. And you look at MedMen, which lost $1 billion in valuation almost overnight when it came out that they were losing as a retailer $1 per gram on every gram sold. And they had to borrow $150 million simply to stay in operation for a 4-month period of time right at the beginning of this year. And so for companies really thinking about what the commodity they're selling is worth and what they're really worth, and especially in relation to the speculation that I see in the Canadian stock market, I think that a lot of these valuations are going to come tumbling down. I personally think that they're bubbling. And for the companies that get it right, time it right, and exit right, this is going to mint perhaps some new billionaires, or certainly some high net worth millionaires. But for the overall, I think that there's going to be a bubble that bursts, and I think that we're seeing it in California. We're seeing it with companies like MedMen, and especially on the producer-processor side. These companies need to be prepared to sell cannabis for, pennies on the dollars that they're getting now. And if they're not viable to do that in a future market, they're not going to be viable, and they're certainly not going to have the valuations that they think that they're worth right now.
That bubble can certainly pop, and right now here in Washington, for example, there is this initial, we'll call them the freshman class that won the lottery, all this stuff, and then a lot of those producer processors who came in with big money behind them, and they thought that it was going to be just money grows on trees, and that came tumbling down pretty rapidly. And then these guys from the actual industry, or from at least the community before it was an industry, came at a perfect timing, and this is happening right now, where they're able to buy one of these failing grows for next to nothing. They're able to build out with the same exact equipment they had, just use it because they know how to use it. And then basically these tier 3s that are all fully funded by themselves, they can get away with producing a pound for around $200 to $300. And they're just going to strategically, as it goes, they're just going to lower the price, and they're going to increase their canopy, and they're going to get up to 2,000 lights in probably no time. And as they do that, they're just going to strategically lower the price. And every time they do that, it's just going to be those same guys in that bubble, that initial bubble, that are just going to keep popping. And it's going to get to this. It is a race to the bottom, because we can compare it to these other industries that are flourishing, like beer and like wine, where they sell prepackaged grapes, and they do differ. There is better seasons for grapes here and there, and there's a better crop sometimes. And so that's what we're looking at. We need to just start getting more real about what it is. And do you love this? If not, then maybe this probably isn't for you, because this is going to get ugly real quick, like really quick.
So Kacey, that's a good transition for you, with angel investors involved in the cannabis sector predominantly for the first 6 or 7 years. That's really changed. So have you seen, with the data, are you able to infer who's investing? Is it angel investors? Are they a minority right now? How's the lending landscape changed, and what's the makeup now? What are you seeing?
I don't really know the total, current national makeup by investment type. We get, some data through our partnerships, but that's something that's still, completely unknown. The number of verticals that are being funded within the cannabis sector, e-commerce, healthcare, information service solutions, startups are growing to fill certain pain points within the cannabis supply chain. We've seen more active investment from accelerators and cannabis focused funds. which are just a reflection of the difficulty in attracting institutional dollars, and just the relative nascency of the space.
So Jerry, this question goes to you for kind of reasonings behind your own M&A and what you've seen. There's a lot of reasons to conduct an M&A. You mentioned that synergy is a word that's overused, and I think maybe the last real space for synergy is an M&A. There's a lot of revenue synergies, financial synergies, operational and cost synergies. So what are some of the recent reasons that you've seen for pursuing an M&A?
The biggest reason that I see out in the market for pursuing M&A is basically to touch more jurisdictions, to increase your total addressable market, that kind of stuff. And then the next level down is more the operational, where revenue synergy expanding within markets. Those are kind of the primary things that I'm seeing. It's really hard to have operational synergies in cannabis because you have redundancies across markets. I think there are a lot of things that you can find. Your corporate development, obviously you can get that synergy, accounting, a lot of that kind of corporate type stuff. But I think it's really, really difficult to find, which is why you need to make sure people, unless you don't want to, one of the things we really look for are, if we are looking at M&A, is to make sure that it's not going to be super high touch, where we're going to have to come in, because we have our own projects that we're working on. If we're tucking something in, it can't be taking a disproportionate amount of resources.
So Kacey, is there an opinion that you used to hold really firmly that you had for a long time that's changed in the last 18 months?
I don't know if I'd say I have an opinion that's changed. I guess I'm just constantly amazed at the evolution of the space and the innovation that exists. Just the new product forms and delivery systems. It's stuff that I didn't expect to see evolve as quickly as it has. So I'd say that.
A couple of things that you've seen that are new or niche that you feel like sharing?
One thing that was mentioned before is just sort of like an experience-focused product. So there are a few companies, one that comes to mind is Lucid Moods, where they focus on a very specific outcome and creating consistency in that product. So they have different pens that are, tailored to different moods. And there's a few different companies that are doing that same sort of thing. And even just the explosion of portable vape pens and just how popular those have become. And the types of consumers that are opting to use those new types of products for discretion. It's just the evolution of the product space, I think, has been the most interesting thing for me.
Mm-hmm. So Justin, I look at cannabis retail shops that have been operating adjacent stores, presumably to sell ancillary products in order to avoid the cannabis taxes, which are in upwards of 37%. So is this a real estate strategy to secure future consumption lounges? Or is this really to avoid taxes?
I think it's a little of, there's definitely a little of both. It's a strategy. You don't want to pay 280E for ancillary items, and you want to definitely predict what's going to happen in this market. And so I think that's an obvious thing, that there's going to be consumption lounges, and those did really great in our gray area, and we miss them, and that's where real education can happen, and that's where you can actually hey, this is how you smoke this, and this is how you enjoy this, and here's a little education on that. And we just don't have the time in the shop right now to do any of that. It's really sad how get in, get out, move them in like a restaurant it is. And again, at that lounge, you can do some restaurant type stuff too, not to stray off topic too much, but
it's a funny analogy though, because I just spoke with a product rep who said that his job to sell oil from the manufacturer to the rec shop was very much like a waiter. And I had to ask him, expand on that. And he said, well, you're dealing with people in the manufacturing industry who are, hippies, or they're just not business, kind of like a waiter might be, just not a professional or whatever.
Right.
And then you go to these shops and they don't really know what they want. They don't have aggregation like a headset to help with inventory control. And so he's the middleman, sort of like a business dev. You have to fight between the software and development engineer and then the project manager. You're the middleman. That's a worse position to be in. So that analogy of the waiter trying to sell a product from manufacturer to retailer, I thought was an interesting analogy.
Definitely.
So Wes, there's factors contributing to cannabis's current growth, all of which require capital. They've been technology, product diversity, international expansion, and displacement of the black market. So what's your 10,000-foot view of where we're at now in the context of how you view the cannabis landscape? Or is there a best practice that you've implemented in your business that's been really helpful that you'd like to share?
Well, for us, the best practice is kind of inherent to our business model, which is that we are sitting in a 10,000-foot view as publishers of cannabis publications. And so we get the privilege and the benefit of meeting and talking with so many different cannabis companies, hearing exactly what they're doing, their wins, their losses, their goals, their dreams. And so for us, it's very easy to kind of look at what the industry is doing, report on it, and then create influence, which is in turn what drives our value for advertising. In relation to the larger industry and kind of the global cannabis market, which is where this is happening, we're still just in an experimental land. And so, we've talked about some potentially touchy subjects, companies worth billions disappearing overnight, small companies, fighting to expand, all of these regulatory issues. I like to say my crystal ball broke 10 years ago. And we can try and interpret and predict, but none of us really knows what's going to happen. And for me, that's probably the most exciting part as a journalist, because it's a constantly shifting landscape. There's always stuff to write about. There's stuff happening. There's dramas playing out. There's, incredible boom and bust stories. As a business owner, it's scary. It's scary to go in to new markets, and I watch people who I'm friends with, or I have business relationships with, who I'm watching, kind of bet the farm. And we're still in a gray market in the sense that it's federally illegal. There is no bankruptcy here in the U.S. If your cannabis business fails, you're losing your home, your car, your bank account, everything, because you can't go to bankruptcy court. In terms of the Canadian market and what I view as overinflated evaluations, for many companies, not all, whether it's going to be lawsuits like you mentioned, Josh, or just people losing, which is part of, buying and investing in stock. It's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out. And so when I sit up, in that metaphorical 10,000-foot view, my thought is kind of twofold. This is still the very beginning of an industry that is going to become global. So this is the ground floor 100%. And at the same time, there are companies that are super well capitalized that are in 10 plus markets. And you ask them and they don't think this is the ground floor. They think they're making moves to be, the Coca-Cola or the one or one of the ones. And I would say that probably nobody is right, because nobody knows how this is going to roll out, how the markets are going to balance themselves, how valuations are going to balance. And to me, again, it's exciting, it's scary, and it's very risky, especially on the investment standpoint. And so, I would encourage, individuals thinking about investing to really be careful what they invest their hard-earned money into. And I would, caution people trying to raise money to be very real about what their actual goals and projections are, because it's great to see companies, selling for billions, achieving multi-billion-dollar valuations. But is that, really grounded in reality? It's very hard to say. I think that at the end of the day, right now, in the U.S. market, the only people really making money are the regulators, which is the states taxing it and the federal government still taxing it. They're making, here in Washington, we tax pot 47% at the retail level. 280E takes on average about 25%. You're looking at upwards of a 70% tax levied on every dollar that passes through a retail store. And so, when we're talking about who's actually making the money, the industry is touching a lot of it. Not a lot of it's actually being retained. And, I would be very nervous to be touching a lot of money, not keeping a lot of money, and then trying to maintain, say, a multi-billion-dollar valuation based on a stock market analysis. I don't know that that's going to hold. But this is the beauty of it, and it is still the Wild West. And I believe we've got at least a decade of experimentation and change and boom and bust. And if you can make it through that or find a way to carve out a niche, whether you're a company or a consumer, you're going to have a lot of fun and potentially make some money.
We're going to end it on this question. I feel like exit strategy is really important right now. There's going to be what I'm calling dumb money, really crazy valuations coming in. And if you're stuck with a legacy, if you feel like your name, your brand, your company is the best, and you want to compete for the rest of your life against, other people's money, that's not really an exit strategy. And I don't believe that a lot of companies, at least in the Northwest, have an exit strategy. And so I want to know from everybody here, we'll start with you, Kacey, how important an exit strategy is. Do you feel it's important to have an exit strategy and time frame?
I think it's important to have an exit strategy, but I think that the time frame is up for debate. I think a lot of people plan for a certain time frame, and that just almost always never ends up being the case. Mm-hmm. And I think that there needs to, just in general, be caution and contingency planning for things not happening as quickly. Hurdles, from regulations, delays, things like that. We've seen in every state market that's tried to deploy a new law.
Mm-hmm. How important is an exit strategy?
I think an exit strategy is really smart, but for me, it's not necessarily an exit strategy. It's important. It's a not wearing all the hats anymore strategy. And I've pulled this like proving model that's been gritty, blood, sweat, and tears. And I'm just excited to be the resident creative director, stoner, like vibe, go around just like sprinkling fairy dust everywhere and just like having fun and like enjoying the process, where right now I'm enjoying it. It's fun. I look back at so much and I'm just like, it's formed me into this again, politician / businessman / school of hard knocks, like graduate, but I'm ready for new resources and like, I want to learn. Like I've got a couple partners just in real estate, and the resources that they brought in, even for my cannabis company, and has nothing to do with my cannabis company, is amazing. So I can only understand like, or imagine what it would be like to get just this amazing strategic partner that's from like real franchise like background, franchising background. That really like I've like essentially faked it till I made it, but off of just pure passion and love for this plant. And I've been to jail for exactly what I do as a businessman. Now I went to drug court for 2 years. Just now I'm ready to just get a professional that really can show me how to do, so I can just kind of enjoy what I like to do. And I can go from the future. I can't do this without the help though, but I could literally be from the future to every green state and just provide like the almanac from back, from Back to the Future for these people. Like I can literally like be 10 years from the, I can help you. Let me help you. So like, I just need the team now to allow me to go around and do that. But I don't want to get out too soon. I want to enjoy this shit, man. This is fun. I worked so hard my whole life to get to this point where I can just, like go around and check out all the bud around the world. Like I'm going to go to Amsterdam and talk about opportunities there. That's going to be so cool. Like I've been, you got to understand, 3 days after I turned 18, I've been property of this country because I was snitched on and busted. And so I haven't been able to travel outside of this country, anything for exactly what I do as a businessman now. So now that I have it expunged from my record, I'm a new man. I'm ready to go. I didn't even get to go to Canada and do the 19-year-old like kick it at the bar thing. So I'm just excited to do all that now and expand my company and see what else is out there because of cannabis. Cannabis almost like my family disowned me for 13 years because of cannabis, and now it's going to be what's, you know, now my family is so proud of me, and they're like, you're a freedom fighter, and I'm sorry, it was just illegal, and it scared the shit out of me, but and so now I'm excited to go and, you know, see the world. It was what ruined my life, and now it's what's going to create my life, and it's pretty. It was all about the sacrifice.
From criminalized to capitalized.
Yes.
It's quite the journey. And with that, we're out of time. I want to thank my guests for coming on, Jerry with Cannex Capital Group and Forefront. Thank you. I want to thank Wes Abney of the Northwest Leaf and Leafchews. Justin, I appreciate you coming out. He's with Hypeherbally. Also, him and Wes joined up for the Higher Than a Space Shuttle. And Kacey with New Frontier Data, I appreciate you being on the line with us today.
Thanks so much.
All right, talk to you later.
Kacey.
Bye.
Bye, Kacey.
So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is a Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out.